There is a bomb about to explode in Europe, and the clock is ticking. This is the story of the fertility and immigration crisis of the old world, its economic, social, and geopolitical ramifications and possible outcomes. In order to run a successful country, crucial factors must be present. Cheap energy, easy access to food and water, stable borders, and a healthy demographic structure, which includes a good fertility rate. Europe, much like the rest of the developed world, is in crisis. We'll start with a brief look at how demographics work. A healthy demographic chart will resemble a pyramid. From the center to the left is the number of women, and to the right are the men. The bars represent the number of people of that gender, in this case, in thousands, with each bar representing an age gap. On the edges, you'll see the year of birth of the people whose bar is closest. In this particular case, you can clearly see the effects of war on birth rates in Italy. The second bars from the bottom show the effects of World War II. Pension systems depend on this type of chart. People working now are securing current pensions or state welfare programs. With an increasing population, this can go on indefinitely. The problem is that the birth rates are declining, and this chart represents Italy's population in 1950. An ever-increasing population has been the norm since humans have existed, even with the inevitable shocks such as wars, famines, or pandemics. Under a healthy demographic scenario, you get a number of things. Lower number of retirees, whose pensions are mostly supported by the working generation, and lower healthcare costs. After them comes the working age population. One group, the older ones, are the most productive and knowledgeable ones. They are at their highest income potential, have low expenses since their house has been or is about to be fully paid for, and their children moved out and started to join the workforce. Since they don't have as many expenses as they used to have, people in this group can invest. The younger group spends a lot of their capital on buying a car, a home, and starting a family. They consume, which is critical for an economy. Finally, there are the infants, who will replace the older population one day. We have become victims of our own success, and there are different reasons for this depopulation bomb. Industrialization. The transition from the farm to the city has made having children a burden instead of help on the farm. A fast industrialization process elevates living conditions but lowers birth rates, and usually, the faster the industrialization and modernization process, the faster the drop in birth rates. This chart shows how long it took for fertility in different countries to fall from 6 children per woman to less than 3. The UK took 95 years, Greece took 70, Brazil took 26, and Iran just 10. Women's emancipation and their participation in the labor force means neither parent has time to look after the kids. As such, the economic models adapted, and a workforce comprised of both men and women with the respective tax contributions became the norm, and we've never looked back. Decrease in mortality. More people live longer and better. The pill and other forms of contraception changed everything, contributing more than anything to lower birth rates. Cultural norms also played a role. The decline of religion's importance has had a significant impact on family structure, just like divorce laws. This has been a long time coming. The replacement level in the developed world is 2.1 children per woman. Replacement cannot occur if a woman does not reach maturity and live long enough to have her own offspring. So the extra 0.1 is built in as a buffer. Besides, there isn't a 50-50 ratio between males and females being born. As we said, the introduction of the pill changed everything. With one or two exceptions, birth rates plummeted in or right after the 1960s. In the 1980s, birth rates fell below replacement levels and have not returned to the 2.1 mark. Mediterranean countries, for instance, are in deep trouble. Not only do they have some of the lowest birth rates, but they also have some of the oldest populations on average. The numbers are devastating. This is data for the median age and birth rates in 2021 in Europe. We'll exclude microstates such as Monaco and San Marino. Portugal had the second lowest birth rate with 1.24 births per woman and the second oldest population with 45 years. Spain, fourth lowest birth rate with 1.43 births and the sixth oldest population at 43.9 years. Italy and Greece don't look any better. 4 countries severely hit by the 2008 financial crisis with high levels of debt. The implications are massive and will be felt for the rest of the century. In theory, a small generation will produce a smaller generation and vice versa. Birth rates will stay low, populations will decline and hit a bottom until fertility stabilizes and then grows, unless there is a concerted effort to boost birth rates right now. Conversely, the UK, France, Sweden are closer to the 2.1 mark. All 4 can present better numbers due to their immigrant communities, but that comes with a cost that we'll talk about later. Economically, a declining population means fewer people to work, which explains current labor shortages. The 2020s is the decade where the younger baby boomers, the generation born between 1946 and 1964, will retire. AI and robotics can certainly cover some of the labor shortages, but it won't be nearly enough. The pension systems will require new or added financing means, for instance, with governments diverting revenue directly to the pension system. To expect people to work longer, make higher salary contributions, or continue the higher immigration influx is not realistic. Furthermore, immigrants will also have their own pension to collect. They worked for it, which seems to be something politicians conveniently forget. If you have a declining population and the fertility problem is not tackled, the problem persists, which means you'll need even more immigration. This disaster has been developing for over 40 years. If not sooner, alarm bells should have rung all over Western Europe by the mid-90s. Even worse was the expectation that immigrants would return home after some time. Angela Merkel alluded to this in her famous 2010 speech in Potsdam. This multicultural approach has failed, utterly failed. The beginning of the 60s, our country called the foreign workers to come to Germany, and now they live in our country. We kidded ourselves a while. We said they won't stay. Sometime they will be gone. But this isn't reality. In 1960, the birth rate in Germany was 2.40, peaking in 1964 at 2.50. 5 years later, Germany entered below replacement level fertility, hitting a low point between 1993 and 1995 at 1.31. This is demography's cruel way of working. It develops slowly, taking a long time to come to fruition, leading governments to overlook it until they are suddenly 25 years into the future, wishing they had done something about it. Some countries are trying to do something about it, and babies seem to be a priority for some governments, even if it's not a priority for people. To make things worse, Generation Z, of humans born between 1997 and 2012, is reported to be the sexless generation, which doesn't bode well if you want to increase the birth rate. Let's look at some birth incentives in action today. Poland has the Family 500 Plus program. Families will receive a monthly fee of 500 zlotys, which is around 112 euros or $110 per month for every child. Low-income families will receive support of 800 zlotys, or around 185 euros or $200 per month for their first or only child, provided they meet the criterion. Hungary has a much more ambitious plan. The government will attribute a loan to young couples up to around 30,000 euros with zero interest on a promise to have children in the future. That loan can be used for any purpose. After each child is born, part of that loan is written off, and if the couple has a third child, the loan will be written off completely. Perhaps the most ambitious part of this plan is a lifetime exemption from income tax for every woman who has a fourth child. There are other measures to tackle depopulation in Hungary. As the government rejects immigration as a factor in any way, government-owned IVF clinics, creating over 21,000 nurseries and housing subsidies for families. Other countries offer subsidies per child born, such as Russia, Italy, or Greece. Greece also invested in medical services and safety networks for many people living in the islands or mountains so that women living in remote areas feel safe about having a baby. Immigration could help. Poland and Hungary look at it as a question of national culture and values, disregarding migration as part of the solution to avoid the multicultural challenges hurting countries like France or Britain. For others, like Greece, it will simply be a question of adjustment and renewal since it has a history of mixing cultures and peoples, be it refugees from Turkey in the early 20th century or Albanians after the fall of communism. Loans, payments, IVF clinics, or medical assistance are all important. Easier handling of work-family responsibilities would help as well. And since we're on the topic, we could suggest another idea, that is decentralization, creating the conditions for people to move to less populated areas. They would find a lower cost of living and a lower population density zone, possibly leading to a lower cost of housing and better living conditions. This could be especially doable for those who work remotely. Low taxation programs for both families and companies would make a big difference, generating new life in less populated locations. With hospitals and schools at reasonable distances, improvement of roads and railways will be part of the course. People will only settle in a place with a minimum of infrastructure in place. All this comes with a degree of government spending, but it would be an investment for the future that many people and political parties could get behind. Enough time has passed to acknowledge the multicultural problems over the mass migration waves that Europe has seen since 1945, as well as how immigration has been beneficial for birth rates and economies. Mass migration imposes problems on a good integration and assimilation process. We should define multiculturalism very quickly. The existence of multiple pockets of immigrant populations in high numbers, living in countries whose national cultural identity, values, and traditions are distinctly different. To promote assimilation, a migrant must learn the language, values, and social norms of the welcoming society. But if that migrant moves to a place where there are already a large number of compatriots, then the natural instinct is to flock towards them. This is what most people will do. We're talking about human beings and social beings who do not like to feel alone, especially when emigrating. Unfortunately, while that is a logical move in the very short term, it is counterproductive because the person in question won't have any incentive to integrate. Being surrounded by familiar aspects, such as other people of the same culture or hearing the same language. Eventually, this can lead to tribalism and the formation of parallel societies. The issue with multiculturalism is that it can get by while there is the belief that things are good. But when times are tough, all grievances and cultural differences come to the surface. This is nothing new. As British soldier and author Sir John Glubb wrote in his famous 1978 writing, The Fate of Empires. In it, Glubb wrote about the different stages of every great empire, although we could also look at it as a civilization. The final stage, the Age of Decadence, has several causes, one of them being the high influx of foreigners. Glubb wrote about what he saw in 1970s London, linking it to past capitals of empires. And as you'll see, when he mentions race, it doesn't necessarily mean skin color or ethnicity. Roman historians often complain of the number of Asians and Africans in Rome. Baghdad in its prime in the 9th century was international in its population. In London today, Cypriots, Greeks, Italians, Russians, Africans, Germans, and Indians jostle one another on the buses and in the underground, so that it sometimes seems difficult to find any British. The same applies to New York, perhaps even more so. This problem does not consist in any inferiority of one race as compared with another, but simply in the differences between them. In the age of the first outburst, the race is normally ethnically more or less homogeneous. This state of affairs facilitates a feeling of solidarity and comradeship. While the nation is still affluent, all the diverse races may appear equally loyal. While the empire is enjoying its high noon of prosperity, all these people are proud and glad to be imperial citizens. But when decline sets in, it is extraordinary how the memory of ancient wars, perhaps centuries before, is suddenly revived. The idle and captious Roman mob, with its endless appetite for free distributions of food, bread, and games, is notorious and utterly different from the stern Roman spirit which we associate with the wars of the early Republic. In Baghdad, in the golden days of Harun al-Rashid, Arabs were a minority in the imperial capital. Istanbul, in the great days of the Ottoman rule, was peopled by inhabitants, remarkably few of whom were descendants of Turkish conquerors. In New York, descendants of the Pilgrim Fathers are few and far between. As with the growth of industry, cities nowadays achieve an ever greater preponderance over the countryside. So will the influence of foreigners increasingly dominate old empires. Once more, it may be emphasized that I do not wish to convey the impression that immigrants are inferior to older stocks. They are just different. and they thus tend to introduce cracks and divisions. In our very first video, we mentioned one of the most important books in geopolitics, Zbigniew Brzezinski's The Grand Chessboard. In one chapter, Brzezinski wrote about the ethnic cauldron that he named the Eurasian Balkans: Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. The three Caucasus republics are still today a place of border disputes, conflicts, and ethnic cleansing. The most notorious one being the Nagorno-Karabakh, an Armenian enclave in Azerbaijan. Then we move to Central Asia, where the frontiers of its states were drawn arbitrarily by Soviet cartographers in the 1920s and 1930s, when the respective Soviet republics were formally established. Their borders were carved out largely on the ethnic principle, but they also reflected the Kremlin's interest in keeping the southern region of the Russian Empire internally divided and thus more subservient. Now that those former Soviet republics plus Afghanistan are independent, the potential for destabilization is immense, with large swathes of people living outside of their country. Take your pick: Azeris in Iran, Russians in Kazakhstan, Uzbeks in Tajikistan, Tajiks in Uzbekistan, or Tajiks and Uzbeks in Kyrgyzstan. Multiculturalism and instability are neither exclusive to Europe nor to the 21st century, which leads us to the geopolitical ramifications. Islamic terrorism, cultural differences, and suspicion of North Africa, Middle Eastern, and Muslim communities have transformed Europe's political scene. Immigration has become a toxic subject, avoided at all costs by many politicians. France, Germany, the UK, the Netherlands, or Belgium have large communities from the locations mentioned before. But not even having the best birth rate in Europe was enough to stop French President Emmanuel Macron from introducing a highly contested raise in the retirement age to provide stability to the French pension system. More recently, a new immigration bill was passed, with Macron needing the support of Marine Le Pen's party. These two events are significant. Europe is witnessing a cultural and civilization clash. Pew Research survey data provides important information. Identity, for instance, is a major indicator. What do Christians and Muslims consider the prime indicator of their identity? Their nationality or their faith? According to the 2006 survey, Muslims tend to put their faith ahead of their nationality by a large margin, with Britain in the lead with 81% versus 7%. Interestingly, the figures are more balanced in France, which has the largest Muslim community in Europe, 46% versus 42%. This may mean a better or longer assimilation process. Still, nationality comes in second, in contrast with Christians. This is evidence of how much the national conscience, but also the cultural and social legacies, are important to Europeans. Secularism, freedom of speech, and gender equality. Also significant is the perception of whether Muslims would like to adopt national customs or remain distinct. The perception tilts clearly in the direction of a distinct culture. Both communities share concerns about Islamic extremism, with an expected level of difference. In 2006, most Muslims in the UK, France, and Germany were concerned about extremism, with Spanish Muslims being the exception. On the national level, the numbers are much higher and even getting worse in some cases between 2006 and 2017. Terrorism and violence help explain the rise in prominence of new parties across the continent, and some questions arise from this. Could we see a European party designating a separate status for Muslims? Could we see a change in nationality laws, or the stripping of nationality for committing crimes or having suspected links to terrorist organizations? In October 2023, this very issue was raised by a former member of Emmanuel Macron's government regarding footballer Karim Benzema's nationality, accusing him of having links with the Islamic Brotherhood. At this point, it seems a matter of time until Marine Le Pen or the AfD reach power in France and Germany, or yield enough influence, as is the case with the Swedish Democrats. Geert Wilders' win in the Dutch elections is another sign of a shift. If failure in integration and assimilation is concerning, so is the spillover from conflicts that Europeans have nothing to do with, such as between Turks and Kurds in Germany. Europeans are losing patience with what they perceive to be the failure of established parties regarding a number of issues. Right now, they do it with their vote, and it has become clear that they feel forced to vote for other parties. It is ridiculous to assume that most people voting for Marine Le Pen or the AfD are fascists. This is a reaction. The action is the degradation of life in the European societies. Terrorism, lack of integration, crime, and a shift to something worse. They are worried. They feel their country has changed and their values, such as tolerance and concern for human rights, are being used against them. There are extremists, of course, but nowhere near the majority. So if this situation deteriorates, what are the options? If European governments switch to a hardline approach, many heads of state in the Arab and Muslim worlds may respond by whipping up frenzy in their diaspora in Europe. Violence and protests will probably follow, leaving those same governments in a bind. For some, a hardline approach could mean ordering refugees whose countries are not involved in a war anymore to leave, stronger deportation laws, tracking down illegal migrants, closing Muslim schools, and revising the attribution of nationality, to name a few. For others, this is just what a normal migration policy looks like. Marine Le Pen has gone as far as suggesting closing all mosques in France. Geert Wilders did the same. France has the largest Muslim community in Europe. It also has the largest Jewish community on the continent, and in the wake of Israel's response to the Hamas attack on October 7th, France registered over 1,000 anti-Semitic acts in the span of a month. In a country with a history of terrorist attacks, this takes a toll on a population and triggers a response over time. There are even more draconian measures that a radical government, if elected, could take. France and Britain seem bound to leave the European Court of Human Rights to be able to deport as many illegal migrants as they deem necessary. Time seems to be running out, and if nothing changes dramatically, then we'll move on to something new. Politically, it means an overcorrection to the right. Socially, perhaps something even worse. The moment a population believes their government and police cannot protect them, they may turn to the army. But the army is not supposed to be deployed to the general population, although that is exactly what happened in Sweden in September to deal with gang warfare. Not to mention the fact that you cannot have the military patrolling the streets indefinitely. If the army also fails to make the population safe, then people will do what people always do whenever they feel there's no one else to protect them. They'll do something themselves, from buying firearms to forming neighborhood patrols or even militias. It won't take long for the first civil unrest event to take place, and that will be the linchpin that will set Europe on fire. It could be revenge for a woman being sexually assaulted in a park in Germany, or another professor being killed in France. Then, the government in place will have to respond, but it will be too late. The civilization confrontation between the West and the anti-West has been going on for some time, perhaps since 9/11. Turkish President Recep Erdogan went to Germany, and Turkish immigrants from Germany, but also from Belgium and the Netherlands, listened to him tell them that assimilation is a crime against humanity. Later, he also encouraged Turkish residents in Europe to have 5 children instead of 3. Clearly, the aim is to transform Europe's cultural and social base through demographics. Strength in numbers. We like to stress this point. This is not the replacement theory. We're not talking about European elites supposedly replacing ethnic Europeans. We're focusing on the goals of prominent leaders in the Muslim world. In October, human rights activist and author Ayaan Hirsi Ali explained the thought process of another important figure, the late Yusuf al-Qaradawi.
The French are growing old, they're retiring, they're not having children. And I remember a Muslim Brotherhood prominent, inspirer of theirs, Yusuf al-Qaradawi, when they would carry out some of these terrorist attacks that they considered jihad, Yusuf al-Qaradawi would say to them, you know what, you don't need to carry out terrorist attacks. The most important strategy for you to follow is to bring in as many immigrants as possible and to have as many babies as possible. And that is how you take over Europe without firing a single shot.
Whether or not Muslims in Europe agree with this is a different story. It is only up to them, and unfortunately, most are caught in the middle as they just want to live in peace. Governments will have a hard time between calming down immigrant communities and avoiding more terrorist attacks, and not losing votes by not providing safety and a Western way of life. An additional constraint on government immigration policy is commodity supply. Upsetting a foreign government could trigger shortages or a trade war. Africa has a significant Muslim population, and if France, Germany or the UK decide to take a hard line against immigration, the retaliation could be severe. Think of uranium from Niger to France, or oil from Libya, Algeria, Kazakhstan or the Persian Gulf. African countries still feel they are used and exploited by the West, and Russia and China are looking to capitalize on that resentment. Europe must try to reverse this sentiment. In a previous video, we mentioned how the 21st century has to be the definitive time for African emancipation. Brimming with life and young people, Africa, one of the origins of the migrant waves, is on the opposite side of Europe. Where one has a young population, the other is old. And where one is underdeveloped, the other is advanced. Europe should work more closely with Africa, if not because it's the right thing to do, at least because it's in Europe's self-interest. European countries should look into investing in the southern continent with infrastructure and companies. After the pandemic, the concern with simpler and shorter distance supply chains has become of vital importance. An economic link between the two continents, where one has the expertise and the other has the potential, would help both sides. Increasing living conditions, wages and jobs would contribute to putting an end to endless migrant waves and the tragedies in the Mediterranean. The world is not perfect, and this means having to work with underdeveloped democracies or autocracies. And so, Europe faces a dire choice. Try to keep a competitive economy, a viable pension system, and survive the coming turmoil with future terrorist attacks and civil unrest? Or accept economic stagnation and the financing problems of the pension system, but remain Western? This may sound uneasy, but Japan made a similar choice decades ago. The Japanese would never accept Tokyo resembling London today. They chose a coherent society over economic growth. Many elections in Western Europe, especially in countries with large Arab and Muslim communities, will be a referendum on this issue, with Britain and Germany in 2025 and France in 2027. The future of Europe hangs in the balance.